Well, hello everyone. I'm really glad you came today. Here we are at the AAIDD 2014 conference, and you know a little bit about me by now, but you know I really don't know anything about you. So how many of you are parents of boys? And how many of you are parents of boys who are past puberty? And how many of you are parents of girls who are past puberty? And how many of you have sexuality? Now, I should see every single person be raising their hands because you know everyone has sexuality, even you. And at different ages, sexuality is expressed differently, and it changes its form. It's important to remember that really parents are the first and most important sex educators of their children. Even when your children are not looking at you and you think they're not paying attention to you, really they are, and they're copying many of the things that you do as a man or a woman. So when does sexuality really begin? Most of the time, parents can ignore sexuality when their children are before puberty, but once they get to puberty, they can no longer ignore that. But sexuality really begins instantly as soon as the sperm from a man and the egg from a woman get together. Some very important things are determined about sexuality of that growing fetus. It's determined how cells will differentiate themselves to become female or male reproductive organs, and that will determine how what hormones will be produced in that person's body, and much of that will determine how their sexuality develops. And of course, during that formation period of the fetus, the biggest sex organ in a person's body is developing. No, not what you think. The biggest sex organ in a person's body is their brain, and that brain development is developing from the very first stages of growth. The in utero development of a fetus is important not only because it's brain development and organ development, but the in utero environment is influenced by many things that you wouldn't expect. For example, the mother's health and nutrition, whether there's alcohol being ingested by the mother that influences the brain development, whether there is domestic violence in a family and the woman's uterus and pregnant belly is assaulted in a violent way, if you're in a car accident, if you take certain medications. And so all of that is influencing sexual development way before you even know that sexual development is going on. As soon as a child is born, the first thing that people want to know, and once they find out that everybody's okay, they say, is it a boy or is it a girl? And so the very first and most important identity that a newborn child has is their gender. And we know, too, that right from the very, very beginning, caregivers right in that nursery there treat boys and girls differently. They dress the girls in pink and the boys in blue, but they also handle boys more roughly than they handle girls, and they handle girls much more gently. Boys are not allowed to cry for as long as girls are allowed to cry, and who really knows what the influence is of any early invasive therapies, whether there are medical issues that need to be performed right at birth, especially if the child has a disability. There might be medical issues that need to be addressed, surgical issues, and nobody really knows whether that has an influence over that individual's sense of their body integrity. So a lot is going on, sometimes even before you even know you're going to have a baby, but certainly from the moment that baby is born, there are influences exerted upon their sexual development. And during infancy, those children are being nurtured by loving parents, hopefully, and the way that those parents show affection toward their new child, and the way that face-to-face and response to a smile or responds to any progress that that child makes is part of that child's development of their own self-esteem and self-image. In some families, affection is expressed very effusively, and in some cultures, a lot of emotional expression is expected and desirable, and yet in other cultures, emotional expression is very quiet and reserved. In some families, anger is expressed in very violent ways, sometimes with physical abuse, of not only of parents but also of the child themselves if they don't perform as the parents would hope they would perform. And of course, all of this applies whether you have an intellectual disability or not, because for the very early part of life, children develop along very similar lines, and whether they have a disability or whether they are typically developing. But those children, they're watching and absorbing what's going on, and eventually they will copy it. So if there's physical violence in the family, when the child gets frustrated, they will use physical violence as a way to express that frustration, if that's what they've learned from their family. Also, children are observing their family's pattern of modesty. In some families, everybody walks around without their clothes. In other families, everybody buttons up to their neck for the whole time. In my family, I didn't know until I was 14 years old that my father didn't sleep in his tie. So we had a kind of a reserved family. But every family has a different idea about modesty. And children will copy that in one way or another. So just when the child ends their infancy and approaches school, there's a lot of sexual learning that goes on. It's the first time, really, when children are with other children of the same age that they are, whether they're in an included setting or whether they're in a segregated setting. They're generally with other kids the same age, whereas in a family, they may be an only child, or there may be older or younger siblings in the family as well as adults. And so children begin the process of making friends and learning they have to get along with people that are not their family, who are less willing to tolerate any unusual behaviors, whether they're sexual or behavioral or academic. And so children need to begin to get along and learn how to cooperate in play situations. These days, with so many elementary schools being inclusive settings, children often get included with typical kids inside school and outside of school. They go to birthday parties with typical kids and with kids with disabilities, and they have friendships, and those friendships are very inclusive because young children haven't developed the prejudices that many older children develop against kids who have learning differences or physical differences. And then look what happens. Oh my goodness. Now you may be saying to yourself, she just has this child entering school. Now she's got puberty. Well, what age do you think puberty begins? No, not what you think. According to Jane Brody, the former health editor for the New York Times newspaper, says that these days puberty begins as early as age 6. So you get into school when you're 5, and then when you're 6, you start some of the changes that are about puberty. Now, they're not visible changes. They're chemical changes that are going on internally, but they're going on. Puberty starts approximately 2 years sooner these days than it did back when the earth was cooling when I was in puberty, if you can remember, if you can imagine that. So puberty begins very early, and this puts people who have a developmental delay at a great disadvantage, because in addition to being chronologically the same age as their peers, developmentally they are often much less mature socially, emotionally, intellectually, and experientially. And yet they're being asked to cope with some very adult emotions and adult feelings at a much more immature chronological age than ever before. And we know that typical kids have a lot of difficulty as they enter puberty coping with that, and those with intellectual disabilities are likely to have even greater disabilities, since the disparity between their physical maturity and their emotional and social maturity is greater than for a typical kid. And so a lot of things happen at puberty, and a lot of things have to change. The obvious changes are physical changes. Girls get bumps in their sweaters, and boys get hair on their arms and other places that they never expected to get that. They get more muscular, there's a growth spurt, and for typical kids there is an intellectual growth spurt that occurs in a less pronounced way among people who have an intellectual disability. And so the differences in intellectual achievement become more apparent as puberty gets underway. Often health ed classes are where kids learn about sex education. But what we found is that the pace of learning in a health education class that's an included class goes way too fast for kids with intellectual disabilities to keep pace, and is oriented in a very different direction to kids who are more socially mature, have had a different array of experiences, and who can catch on to the information much more quickly. And so a lot of times kids who are in an included health education class say things to me like, I'm afraid to go to school because in health education I learned that teenagers drink alcohol and have sex and do drugs, and I'm afraid of them. Even though I'm a teenager, I only got a very mixed message and only partial understanding of what the health education class was about. And so it becomes important at this point for there to be a little bit of a digression from that inclusion and some special support given to pubescent youngsters with intellectual disabilities in a smaller setting with some more intensive training, not so much to be Masters and Johnson, but really about how to manage the demands of puberty and some of the social as well as the physical demands placed on kids with less ability to begin with. And what schools do can only do so much, and really parents at home really need to support and practice with their youngsters, because the schools don't really have the ability or the inclination to do so. Scripting of what to do to show somebody that you like them, develop scripts and practice them. For girls, how to use menstrual pads and how to protect your clothing from staining. Boys, of course, also need to know that at some point during puberty they'll find out that although they've been playing with that thing for a long time, during puberty is the first time that they will ejaculate, and it can be quite a surprise or even a shock and even alarming if they are not prepared for that event. For boys in particular, a lot of our boys that we know who have developmental disabilities have taken a long time to become toilet trained and stay dry overnight. And of course, mom and dad were so proud of that boy when he was able to stay dry overnight. And then maybe one morning he wakes up and his pajamas are wet. And he's thinking, oh my goodness, mom and dad are going to be so disappointed because I wet my pajamas again. And this, if they're not prepared for the event of a wet dream or a nocturnal emission, that they can be very upset by that event, and it can lead to some unusual behaviors like flushing your pajamas down the toilet so mom won't find out about it. Mothers eventually do find out about it. Or as one mother told me, that she had punished her son to stop blowing his nose in his pillow until she finally realized that that was not what that was. And she felt very bad about it. At any rate, she got over it, and so did her son. Again, it's important to include boys and girls in decisions at this point that affects their social and sexual development. For example, who their friends are. You may be friends with the parents, and it may be very convenient for you to have your child friends with their child. However, the child may not like that child, or may find that they like someone who's less able or more able than they are, or who lives on the other side of town, which makes it kind of inconvenient. But it's important to acknowledge that the child has opinions now and to support them in any way that you can. So there we go. Those are some of the more obvious changes that happen. But then you add increased hormones into this mix, and there's a lot of stuff that goes on. Emotions, sexual emotions, as well as all the other emotions, are much more intense as those hormones come into play. And unfortunately, they don't come into play and look the way you set a thermostat on your heating system. Let's all set it for 70 degrees, then we'll all be comfortable. In fact, hormones come in surges, so sometimes, some periods of time, there'll be surges of hormones, and then they'll back off. And during those surges of hormones, kids are very emotional. You've probably noticed that teenage girls are not just a little bit happy, but they're hysterical and can't stop giggling. Or they get a pimple on their face, and they think the world is coming to an end. And so they zig and zag in those emotions related to hormonal changes that are beyond their control. And boys, in fact, have hormonal changes that give them spontaneous erections. And Mrs. Jones, the spelling teacher, is not happy when she sees Billy with an erection when he's supposed to write the spelling words on the blackboard. It's not Billy's fault or decision to have an erection at that time. It's something that Billy's body is doing, not Billy himself. And so teachers need to really understand that spontaneous erections are not within the child's control, and really need to be understanding about and know how to manage that by maybe letting Billy not write those words on the board right at that time, but give him a little chance for that erection to go away and subside, and for Billy to relax a little and not come to hate spelling because Mrs. Jones insists that he get up and write the spelling words on the board. It really is important for teachers to understand some of these sexual issues of puberty, although there is no college or university course that Ruth Luckison and Sunsuk Park and I have discovered in our research that help teachers to learn the kinds of things they really need to know about in their classrooms. A study we did at the University of New Mexico really yielded the fact that it's my course at the University of New Mexico that's the only one we could find. So that leaves a lot of teachers really not knowing what to do when sexual issues interfere with learning in their classroom. And if you think teachers don't know about it, parents don't know about it either. In fact, parents have been able to ignore sexuality until something goes wrong. And then when things go wrong, they really have to kind of backpedal and see what is it that they missed out and how can they make it up to their kids now. Again, masturbation issues arise. They arise at school when a boy has a spontaneous erection or a girl becomes aroused spontaneously, to understand that that feeling will go away if you focus your attention on something else, and fortunately or unfortunately it will come back again, maybe at a more convenient time. But it is not within the child's control as to when that happens. And this applies not only to kids with disabilities, but to kids without disabilities as well. The kids without disabilities are often able to figure out on their own what to do. For example, boys will learn to wear a very long sweatshirt when they go to school so that if they are aroused, it won't be obvious to the other kids in the class or to their teacher. Kids with intellectual disabilities don't know what to do, and it's kind of an overwhelming urge that they want to get some relief of that. And so They often do inappropriate things to get relief. Sometimes they get sent down to the principal's office for it. Sometimes mother has to come to school. And sometimes they get an understanding teacher who understands what's going on and doesn't make a big deal out of it. Again, this is the time where new standards for modesty have to be put into place with some strictness, because once a child's body is mature looking, the culture that we live in will not tolerate sexually inappropriate behavior. When a child has an infantile body, people say, oh, it's just a little boy or it's just a little girl. So what if he peed on your shoe at the supermarket? No big deal, it's just a little boy. But if that boy has a mature body, or that girl lifts up her shirt and she has a maturely developed body, there will be a lot of embarrassment to the family. And if it's more intense than that the error is, there may even be some police involvement and community sanctions against that person and their family, and very unpleasant. Once a child looks grown up, the community expects that they act that age. You've all been to the nail salon and you see little girls come in, they're wearing little high-heeled shoes, they've got very grown-up looking bodies, they're getting manicures and pedicures, and they're dragging a Barbie doll or a teddy bear with them. I think that exemplifies that their bodies are very grown up, but they're still little girls in many other ways. And I think this is the struggle, especially for our people with intellectual disabilities, who are more likely to want to cling to some of those juvenile behaviors for way longer. Sometimes social acceptance at school becomes very different. Being accepted becomes very important to teenagers, especially as they're adjusting to the changes in their own feelings and their own physicality. They are much less willing to accept difference in others. And so the friendships from elementary school may not survive puberty. Teenagers need to have the same kind of sneakers, like the right kind of music, wear the right kind of shirt, and anyone who deviates from that is an outsider. Sometimes the friendships that were formed in elementary school are undermined by family members. For example, a typical child in the 7th grade or 8th grade is ready perhaps at the mall to be there on their own for periods of time. And John and Bill used to go to the mall with one of the mothers or one of the dads. But Bill's mother says John needs to have supervision all the time when he's at the mall. He can't have that degree of independence, whereas the typical child's parent recognizes their child needs more independence. And so those trip to the mall activities stop, and some of the bonds of friendship are no longer viable because parents intercede as their child needs more or less supervision. The friendships that do survive, sometimes they change into helping friendships, which are very valuable but not the same as having a peer friendship. So helping Johnny to do his Cub Scout project is very nice for a typical kid to help his friend with the project. But in fact, the car may end up being more perfect, but it won't be the child's work, and the child who has the disability will not have benefited from the experience of making a car, imperfect as it may be. And these are all important things for parents to know, so that they let their child do what they can instead of aiming for perfection. Sometimes interest in the opposite sex develops both in typical boys and girls and in boys and girls with intellectual disabilities. However, sometimes the person with intellectual disabilities does not know how to express that interest in ways that are more conventional, and so may be interested in touching a girl in their class or even their teacher or even their mother, and just as a way of exploring what is it like and knowing what the opposite sex is like. Of course, these are not behaviors that need to be encouraged, and they should be discouraged, very strictly discouraged. So friendships change, and we've talked a little bit about that. At this time also, because of the intellectual surge that occurs with puberty, the interests of friends may start to differ, and the bonds that held kids together, that they played together, no longer apply, and so they're interested in different things. I can't underscore enough how important it is not to overvalue a friendship of a person with a disability with a typical friend. Friends with and without disabilities are at least equally as important, because once the friendships with typical kids dissolve and adulthood comes into play, and those kids leave school and go on to business or to the service or into marital relationships, and the child with the disability goes into transition or goes into more supportive employment, that they really need to have peers that have a similar set of experiences that they do and a similar degree of independence as well. I think we talked about a lot of this. Disability prejudice. Now, not what you're thinking. A lot of times if parents tell their kids with disabilities that it's better to have a friend without a disability, the kids with disabilities develop a prejudice and say, I'm not going to participate in disability-related activities or have friends with disabilities because they're not important. I want to have typical friends. I want to marry the cheerleader. I want to marry Britney Spears. And if you don't look like Britney Spears, I don't want anything to do with you. And parents sometimes foster this inadvertently, and it's not a good thing, because when it comes to romance in adulthood, it's really with a person of similar ability and similar degree of independence and a similar life trajectory that's going to be the most likely place to find romance and acceptance and happiness. Sometimes people have told me as adults that cookies and TV are their only friends because they've abandoned other people with disabilities and they no longer have friends without disabilities. It's a sad adulthood without friendships and support, and it also makes you a more likely victim of sexual abuse or other kinds of exploitation if you don't have a strong social network and a strong support group among your peers. Friends have their own struggles adjusting to adulthood. There are different degrees of independence and ability as adulthood comes into play. Those become more obvious, and it's important for everyone to recognize that people need to have other friends that are similar to themselves. You know, every day I go to a different state and I give a talk about social and sexual development, and most of the time I'm very happy to do that. I meet people from different parts of the country, different ethnicities, different cultural backgrounds, and it's wonderful. But you know, at the end of the day, when I go home and I take off my pantyhose and I want to relax, who do I call my friends? Mostly they're women and men of a similar age to myself, a similar degree of education, live in an environment not terribly unlike my own. And when I say, whew, did it just get really hot in here, they know what I'm talking about. I don't have to explain how I got here. They know how I got here. And I think it's the same with people with disabilities as well. Transition from school to work and from childhood to adulthood is a very important transition. The cornerstones that were laid in sex education and sexual safety, whether a person expects to be sexually active or not, everyone needs to be sexually safe. You cannot have a job and ride public transportation and be independent if you are at great risk of being sexually exploited by another person. And so with good training, a person can make themselves aware of what the boundaries are within their relationships and when somebody is overstepping that boundary. And know what to do and know who to tell and know how to be safe in relationships. Discussing the hopes and dreams of young people are very important. You get to choose what you like to do, who you like to spend your time with, and how you like to spend your time. That sense of self is an important part of sexual development. And in these days, when we look at person-centered planning as one of the ways that we engage people in forming their map of how their future life will be, unless a person has felt comfortable in expressing themselves and safe from ridicule by their parents or teachers, that they will say, I don't like to do this, or I do want to do this. I like this day program. I like going to school, or I want to be friends with Bill or Mary or Harriet. And not just be docile and do everything that somebody manipulates them into doing. Sexuality education and the accompanying skills of autonomy and knowledge of self and confidence make all of these hopes and dreams possible in a realistic way. I'm really glad that you came here today, and what I really like to say at the end of a talk about sexuality is, this was very good for me, and I hope it was as good for you as it was for me, because really, isn't that what life is all about? And I'll talk to you another time. Thank you very much.